welcome to The World Today. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
And I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines.
A Russian ultimatum to Ukrainian troops in Mariupol to lay down their weapons passes, as today marks 2 months since Russia's so-called special operation there.
Countries reduce mask mandates as COVID restrictions wane. Plus, ban from Wimbledon, world number 2, Daniil Medvedev, among several tennis stars set to be excluded over Russia's war.
Hey, thanks again for joining us. A Russian ultimatum to Ukrainian troops in Mariupol to lay down their weapons has passed. A Marine commander in Ukraine's last stronghold in the southern city, a steelworks plant, says his men might have only a few hours left. Bear in mind, this was just a few hours ago. Ukraine has reached a preliminary agreement with Russia for a humanitarian corridor to evacuate civilians there, but these have failed in the past. However, on plans to evacuate 6,000 people from Mariupol today, following that agreement with Russia, the city's mayor says the evacuation corridors between Mariupol and Zaporizhzhia would be open from 2 o'clock local time.
He said that residents will be able to board buses from the west end of Kuprina Street near Port City Mall, the junction close to the besieged Azovstal plant still, and the main road east out of Mariupol. A former resident of Mariupol says people are nervous about leaving the embattled city because they fear the situation is just as bad in other parts of Ukraine.
Meanwhile, Russia says it has test-launched its new Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile. According to President Vladimir Putin, it would provide food for thought for those who try to threaten Russia. It was shown on TV being briefed by the military that the missile had been launched from Plesetsk, the country's northwest, and hit targets on Kamchatka Peninsula and the far east of Russia. Berlin has chosen not to make public all the weapons it sent to support Ukrainian soldiers. According to the Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, Germany would help Kyiv maintain more advanced weapons systems. It might buy and train soldiers to use them. During a news conference in Riga with her Latvian counterpart, Baerbock said other partners are now supplying armored vehicles and would like to say here and clearly, this is not taboo for us either, even if it sometimes sounds like it in the German debate. We have already agreed to such deliveries, but we do not have anything available at a short notice that we can now deliver really quickly and immediately. When asked about Germany, whether Germany would be sending its Panzer Haubitz 2000 artillery system, which some experts say Ukraine needs to mount a counterattack against Russian forces in the Donbas region, she said Germany will train key soldiers on using and maintaining more advanced systems which it might obtain from other allied countries or buy outright. As she replied, if partners deliver artillery that we can no longer deliver, we will help with training and maintenance. Baerbock also promised a long-term strategy to support Ukraine.
Meanwhile, her counterpart, Latvian Foreign Minister Edgars Rinkēvičs, also at the joint news conference in Riga, revealed that the European Union is preparing new measures to prevent Russia from evading sanctions imposed over the war in Ukraine. Rinkēvičs also said Latvia would be supporting Finland and Sweden in joining NATO. According to him, we're going to be the first to congratulate and support them, and I also hope we will be one of the first countries to also ratify such a decision.
Meanwhile, the Pentagon says Ukraine's partners have provided it additional military aircraft and parts to repair others in Kyiv's arsenal that were damaged or inoperable. According to Pentagon spokesman John Kirby, they've received additional aircraft and parts to help them get more aircraft in the air. He says Washington has not provided aircraft to Kyiv.
Many dozens.
I would just say, without getting into what other nations are providing, that they have received additional platforms and parts to be able to increase their fleet size, their aircraft fleet size. I think I'd leave it at that. No, I mean, I would say we certainly have helped with the transshipment of some additional spare parts that have helped with their aircraft needs, but we have not transported whole aircraft.
Well, we'll be discussing this in a bit, but the Kremlin has accused Ukraine of changing tune during peace talks and slowing the process of that ever happening. The Kremlin accused Ukraine of going back on commitments it made during peace talks and says it was having bad consequences for the negotiations. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the pace of talks left much to be desired and the ball was in Kyiv's court after Russia handed a document to the Ukrainian side. He said Moscow is waiting for a response, but according to Ukraine's lead negotiator, it's hard to predict when peace talks might resume. In his comments on repeated Israeli offer to host a summit between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky, Peskov said there would be need to provide tangible reason for such a meeting to hold. The Kremlin also says a reported ban on Russian players taking part in this year's Wimbledon tennis tournament in Britain would hurt the event itself, given Russia's tennis prowess, and that was unacceptable. President Putin's schedule today, Mr. Peskov says Russian metals companies are facing hostile attitudes from what Moscow calls unfriendly countries, and Russia would come up with a plan to combat this.
Today marks 2 months since the start of the invasion in Ukraine, where about 5 million Ukrainians have fled their homes, cities bombarded, thousands have died. Earlier this week, President Volodymyr Zelensky said about 2,500 to 3,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed so far, and up to 20,000 Russian troops. Moscow has given no updates on its casualties since March 25, when it said over 1,000 had died. Western estimates of Russian losses are many times higher. Ukraine said civilian deaths are impossible to count, estimating at least 20,000 killed in Mariupol alone. There have been on-off negotiations between Ukraine and Russia since the start of the war. Here's a report on 2 months since the invasion.
Russia invaded Ukraine on February the 24th, calling its action a special military operation to demilitarize Ukraine and eradicate what it calls dangerous nationalists backed by an expansionist NATO military alliance. President Putin said as much in a television broadcast at the beginning of the invasion.
The People's Republic of Donbass asked Russia for help. I decided to conduct a special military operation. It aims to protect people who've been bullied and subjected to genocide by the Kyiv regime for 8 years. For that, we will strive to demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and will bring to justice those who committed multiple bloody crimes against civilians, including Russian citizens.
The West and Kyiv accused President Vladimir Putin of unprovoked aggression. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on February the 24th condemned what he called Russia's cold-blooded invasion of Ukraine and announced additional steps to strengthen the alliance's deterrence and defense.
This is a deliberate, cold-blooded and long-planned invasion. Despite its litany of lies, denials and disinformation, the Kremlin's intentions are clear for the world to see. Russia's leaders bear full responsibility for their reckless actions and the lives lost.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday, February the 24th, called on all citizens who are ready to defend the country from Russian forces to come forward, saying Kyiv would issue weapons to everyone who wants them.
We're already handing out weapons and will hand them out to defend our country to everyone who wants and has the capacity to defend our sovereignty. The future of Ukraine depends on every citizen.
US President Joe Biden hit Russia with a wave of sanctions from February, measures that impede Russia's ability to do business in major currencies, along with sanctions against banks and state-owned enterprises.
The Russian military has begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine. Without provocation, without justification, without necessity, this is a premeditated attack.
On February 27th, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered his military command to put Russia's deterrence forces, a reference to units which include nuclear arms, on high alert, citing aggressive statements by NATO leaders and economic sanctions against Moscow. As Russian forces advanced towards Kiev, they encountered fighting by Ukrainian forces in the town of Bucha. On February the 28th, a bridge was blown up near the town, and it was unclear whether it had been bombed by Russian troops or destroyed by the Ukrainian side. March the 1st, Russian missile attacks hit the center of Ukraine's second-largest city, including a residential area and the regional administration building. The deadly attacks on the city killed at least 10 people and injured 35. A few days later, NATO rejected Ukrainian calls to help it protect its skies from Russian missiles and warplanes, but Europe promised more sanctions to punish Russian President Vladimir Putin.
The only way to actually implement something like a no-fly zone is to send NATO planes into Ukrainian airspace and to shoot down Russian planes, and that could lead to a full-fledged war in Europe. President Biden has been clear that we are not going to get into a war with Russia.
The next day, Pope Francis said the Ukraine conflict is not a military operation, but a war.
In Ukraine,
rivers of blood and tears are flowing in Ukraine. This is not just a military operation, but a war which sows death, destruction, and misery.
Che semina morte, distruzione e miseria.
NATO warned Russia its war must not escalate beyond Ukraine. And March the 9th, a children's hospital in the besieged port of Mariupol was bombed. The United Nations Secretary General on March the 14th sounded the alarm over Russia, raising the alert level for its nuclear forces after invading Ukraine, describing it a bone-chilling development.
Further escalation of the war, whether by accident or design, threatens all of humanity. Raising the alert of Russian nuclear forces is a bone-chilling development. The prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of possibility.
In the middle of March, the US and Chinese president spoke on a video call about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, warning China against helping Russia. All of this is not without the Russian, Ukrainian, and other delegates negotiating to end the invasion. Since the invasion, President Zelensky has received the Polish Deputy Prime Minister and Prime Ministers of the Czech Republic and Slovenia, EU Commission President, among other leaders, in a show of high-level backing for the Ukrainian president. 2 months since the start of the war, about 5 million Ukrainians have fled their homes, and even though the fight is now in the east, it isn't without cities which have been shattered and the deaths in their thousands.
Our correspondent in Washington, Maria Bird, joins us now. Maria, great to see you, as always. Do we know how big, this new package by President Biden to Ukraine is?
This package is going to be about $800 million. And as of yesterday, they were expecting it to come out by the end of this week. If not, it could take a little bit longer, just depending on the approvals that are needed to sign it. And that would put the aid from the U.S. to Ukraine close to $3 billion. And so this aid package is really going to look at providing more military artillery. This is going to really be trying to strengthen the Ukrainian military and their capacity to be able to fight the war.
Right, and in the weeks immediately following Russia's invasion, Western allies, including the U.S., sought to draw a distinction between defensive and offensive weaponry, preferring to send Ukraine anti-tank missiles and anti-aircraft missiles than to provide more heavy artillery. How different will this package be from the ones that have been sent before by the U.S.?
The package before, as you mentioned, defensive versus offensive, and I think this is really about how do we build or assist Ukraine with building an infrastructure and a military infrastructure that allows them to be able to not just be defending themselves against Russia, but also putting up barriers and putting strategic things in place to ensure that the war can potentially end much sooner. So I think they're really looking at the tactics, they're really looking at the strategic way in which they can support, and some of that is with some of the heavier artillery that they're looking to put in place, and some of, as you mentioned, some of those actual tankers and things that are used in a way of kind of building an offensive military backing.
Maria, clarify for us, because we heard the Pentagon spokesman, John Kirby, saying that Washington had not provided aircraft to Kyiv. So is that the exclusion to this package, for example?
So aircrafts are being considered, and I think that's what is going to, if we see it take a little bit longer than the 36 hours they initially said as of yesterday, then that could be part of it. We know that it's been said in the past that aircrafts and any type of aircraft that potentially could detonate bombs and things of that nature could potentially create more intensity between Russia and Ukraine. And so that was kind of being refrained from as it related to the U.S. and NATO. But we know that this announcement of the additional $800 million, President Biden made that, or there were allegations or potential alluding to that being the case after a meeting with NATO. And so it's clear that NATO, and including the U.S. and President Biden, are very much in alignment about how they're going to be even more strategic, but even more forceful in the way in which assisting Ukraine in this war efforts.
Another thing to think about is the U.S. government considering how many Ukrainian soldiers are left to fight this war?
Mm-hmm. That's very key. I mean, we know that the U.S. has stated before that they will not be actually putting boots on the ground, meaning U.S. military personnel on the ground, but they will be in obviously bordering countries like Poland. But the real question is, as you stated, if we're seeing a decrease in the number of military personnel in Ukraine, the Ukrainian military, does that then put greater pressure on the U.S. and NATO allies to put boots on the ground? And so I think that this is a strategic move to say that we're going to have to be a little bit more strategic in nature in supporting Ukraine and providing them with additional military resources that could potentially flip what we're seeing today, whereas we're seeing major casualties, especially with the Ukrainian military and obviously with the innocent civilians.
Finally, Maria, in the past few days, we have seen President Vladimir Putin saying Western sanctions have failed, in fact, deteriorating the economy of the West. He contends that the sanctions backfired against the United States and its European allies, and that's because of the measures he put in place to counter those sanctions. How are members of the Congress reacting, as well as American citizens, to the way the economy has turned out as a result of this war?
Well, you can see here in the U.S., there are, we've obviously had interest rate increases to try to settle down the inflation, the hefty rate of inflation that was occurring, trying to stabilize the economy. There are projections that we could see somewhat of a recession. Some of the job boom that we've seen could decrease. But I think that the U.S. was prepared for that. We know that Russia and Ukraine were actually trade partners of the U.S. and obviously other NATO allies. And so trying to, and that has been the discussions even before the sanctions were put in place as to how that would be redirected and potentially how to still sustain the U.S. economy and obviously other economies across the world as a result of many of the sanctions that were put forth. But at this time, I think the U.S. is prepared to be able to manage forth despite what Russia believes is backfiring on the U.S. And we know that there was going to be a long-term impact on Russia with these sanctions. It was not going to be overnight. So the real question is, in the next 6 to 12 months, what will we see the impact on Russia? And even if the war ends, will that mean that the gates of trade are reopened between Russia, the U.S., and NATO allies?
Well, Maria, thanks again for joining us. We'll be reaching out to you for some more reactions as we've seen this war progressing in a new phase. Well, that will be it on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But coming up on the program, though, well, we're talking about the mask mandate and its removal in parts of the United States as the government decides it will no longer enforce the mandate on airplanes, on trains, and even in enclosed spaces after a court ruling in Washington.
Welcome back. Health officials say they are now investigating unexplained cases of hepatitis in children in 4 European countries and the United States. Cases of hepatitis or liver inflammation have been reported in Denmark, Ireland, the Netherlands, Spain, and also part of the United States. The cause of the infections is not yet known. Last week, UK health authorities said they had detected higher than usual cases of the infection among children. The European Centre for Disease Control did not specify how many cases have been found in 4 European countries in total. But the World Health Organization said less than 5 had been found in Ireland and 3 found in Spain. It added that the detection of more cases in the coming days was likely.
We're still in the COVID-19 pandemic, and today many Israelis welcomed the government's decision to scrap the mandatory order of wearing COVID-19 masks indoors. Its second such revision after the measure was briefly dropped and then restored last year in response to a rise in cases. That decision, which applies to closed public venues, will go into force from Saturday, April 23rd, subject to approval by a Parliament Oversight Committee. According to the government statement, masks will still be required of people in high infection risk venues, like flights, hospitals, and care homes. Israelis have not had to wear masks outdoors since April 2021. Last June, the indoor mask mandate was dropped for 2 weeks and restored due to a surge in the Delta variant.
What I think about the government's decision to stop having us wear masks indoors is it's wonderful. We can see one another again. We can see our faces. We can breathe. And also, I must say, being outside for me and having a mask, we need the air. We need the air and we need to see one another. I'm happy.
I think that the government now, the decision of stopping wearing masks is right. They're doing a right decision now. And it's not going to help anyone wearing masks. It's just making people scared and mean to each other. And I'm happy that it's over.
What I think about the government's decision to stop...
Well, over in China, to prepare the 3,000 plus orders of groceries and essentials a careful supermarket sends out every day to locked-in Shanghai residents, manager Zhang Wei wakes at 5 a.m. after a night in a sleeping bag in her office floor. Now, Zhang and 43 colleagues have been hunkered down inside the store in Shanghai's western Qingjing suburb since April 1, isolated from the outside world while working long days to fill online orders from neighboring housing compounds. Now, the branch is one of the more than 1,000 grocery stores open during Shanghai's lockdown, albeit under stringent requirements to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The city government is trying to increase the number of stores open. Shanghai locked virtually all its 25 million residents into their homes at the start of April after COVID cases began to surge.
Still in Shanghai, the city reported 7 people were infected with COVID had died the day before. The city has continued to see long lines of residents queuing for COVID swab tests. Now, all of those cases were elderly with underlying health conditions who were vaccinated against COVID. But from Monday, the city reported over 17,000 new local asymptomatic coronavirus cases That figure is down from 19,831 on the previous days. Symptomatic cases stood at 3,084, up from 2,417, though this included 974 asymptomatic people who later developed symptoms. China's COVID elimination strategy requires testing, tracing, and centrally quarantining all positive cases and their close contacts. While tens of thousands of people have already been sent to isolation facilities, many more are forced to isolate in their homes due to the proximity to infected people.
And still in China, which is one of the countries that have vaccinated a mass population, data released from the National Health Commission today from its mainland says that it has administered over 3.319 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses. The vaccine doses have been cumulatively administered at the end of Tuesday in 31 provincial level regions and Zhejiang Production and Construction Corps on the Chinese mainland. The Municipal Health Commission said Beijing had administered over 61 million doses for more than 23 million residents as of Tuesday. Government at all levels are currently adopting multifaceted measures to accelerate vaccination among people aged 60 or above, one of the priorities of China's efforts to combat COVID-19. The measures also include attempts to dispel the elderly's possible misgivings about vaccination, to raise their awareness about its efficacy, and help people with limited mobility to also get the jab.
Well, back to those mask mandates, but this time in the United States, where the Biden administration says it would appeal a court order lifting mask mandates on public transportation if health officials say it's necessary. That decision comes after a federal judge in Florida ruled that the mandate was unlawful. Much earlier in the day, President Joe Biden said it's up to them when asked if Americans should continue to mask up on planes, trains, and in taxis. At Reagan National Airport, where the majority of passengers were still wearing masks, their reaction was mixed. A lot to hear the reactions of those passengers. Guess we have to move on, though.
Joining us now, Dr. Abdulaziz Barko is a health scientist. He joins us from Houston, Texas. Thanks, Doctor, for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Were you surprised at the federal judge's order in Florida ruling that the mandate was unlawful?
Yes, it is surprising, given the fact that the CDC is the agency responsible for giving these guidance and providing some policies and laws that are meant to protect people. But on the other hand, it didn't come as a surprise, because there are a lot of things that are going on. A lot of people are very much tired of these mandates, and therefore there would be tendency for people to go to court to seek some redress whenever there's policy that is they're not happy with.
So essentially, after that, we had companies and government agencies in the U.S. announcing that, they will no longer enforce the mandates. And though we heard the U.S. Justice Department saying that it will only appeal the ruling if the CDC supports doing so. But what role do you think individual businesses, companies, organizations should be taking at this point?
I think a lot of these policies within these companies are very much driven by economy and the sustenance of their business. And a lot of these transportation businesses have been very much tired of the chaos that goes in within their fleets and so on. And I think they have they really like to see these mandates go away. So I believe that a lot of them would be so happy that these mandates are being taken away to allow them to do their own businesses.
I think your power just went out, Doctor. That's fine. Something we're used to
Power
here.
is out. 1 second.
Well, he does seem to have taken off, I guess, to check on that power situation. But I know that the judge in Washington did rule against the mask mandate. Dr. Bako, another judge in Washington ruled against it, and a lot of people, it seemed, like the U.S. itself was removing, the mask mandate for people, especially in flights and in transportations. So people's attitudes during during the protocols and now after, how important is the average American's health to him, especially knowing that we're still not in the clear with COVID?
A lot of the times it just depends on who you ask, and that the country is being sharply divided between Democrats and Republicans, and also different kinds of responses to policies. So some people are of the opinion that they want these mandates to go away, and some people are very much happy with it. They want to be sure that they are being protected. They won't want to go into a flight in which a lot of people are not wearing masks. So it just depends on how people weigh their own risks of contracting COVID-19.
Would you say the U.S. has handled COVID well? I know there was a great vaccination campaign, and as countries move further into the year, many are considering removing those non-pharmaceutical measures against COVID because more people are getting vaccinated. But do you think the government has performed well when it comes to handling this coronavirus pandemic?
So there were a lot of failures in the beginning, but I believe that the government has responded well especially in the later part of the pandemic. Now we have seen how the numbers crashed and went down, although that now we are seeing a little rise in the infection rate. But I think the government has done well, particularly in the second half of the pandemic, in curtailing these rising infections and particularly hospitalizations and deaths.
If we move a little away from the US and talk about what China is doing, some have said they have a dynamic zero COVID pandemic restrictions, and some have also called that draconian and, essentially their methods. As a health scientist, what do you make of it, seeing as, Wuhan was where COVID-19 said to have originated, and seeing how other parts of the world also, in their mandates and other protocols to stem COVID-19?
So the situation in China is a little bit dicey, particularly given the fact that how they were able to curtail the infection in the beginning. The laws that they put in place and the highly restrictive laws that they put in place gave them the opportunity to be able to be economically productive much more than other countries. So their economy has grown. So that is one part. And the other part is that a lot of people have not been infected. That means that a large population of China does not have natural immunity to COVID-19. And that means they are highly, highly vulnerable when they take off these restrictions in an uncontrolled manner. So it is highly restrictive, it is draconian, but I think at this point in time, given the fact that they have their rate of vaccination is not as good as it should be, particularly for the elderly and those living in rural areas. So there would be a lot of caution that needs to go in before they can be able to kind of change or remove certain restrictions. So it is a very dicey situation that is bordering on both economy, politics, and also health.
Looking at the outlook of, what we're facing, and this is other stories coming in different parts of the world. There is the Ukrainian crisis, which seems to have overtaken everything else. Would you say that COVID-19 is still a threat?
We would hope that we will leave COVID-19 behind us, but it is definitely still a threat. since we still have infections going on, new variants every day coming out. So while we would really want to leave COVID behind us and not want to allow COVID to define who we are and how we live, definitely it's something that we always have to be taken care of and be aware of, and taken measures to make sure that we do not go back to what happened in early 2020.
Well, talking about leaving COVID behind, let's talk about what health officials are investigating, what they call unexplained cases of hepatitis in children in 4 European countries and in the United States. What are your thoughts on this?
It is still in the investigative phase. A lot of epidemiological investigations are going on. I have read some of the early theories that are being projected is that this is an adenovirus infection because a lot of the individuals that have these hepatitis have been they have been found to have these adenoviruses. So it is still under investigation, but it is something that the entire world should be on the watch out for, because I think that's how COVID started, with some symptoms from one place or some few places in China, and then it exploded and it was found in all other parts of the world. So who knows? It might be a new emergent infection, or it might be something else.
The U.S. Alabama's public health department said 9 cases were found in children aged 1 to 6 years, and I think 2 needing liver transplants. In terms of the cases, and this is hepatitis, and with what you said, that if this could expand to something as big as COVID, which has killed thousands of people, what is the solution? What should countries be doing now? And then how should they be handling some of these cases that have come up?
The most important thing is surveillance. Surveillance from obtaining data from various public health departments and local public health departments, the state public health departments, giving guidance to the federal health departments on cases of these liver diseases that they have been identifying. I would hope that it does not become as big as COVID, given that in some of these countries, they have mentioned that these infections have occurred in a very long time, or as far as 1 year back. So if it were something that is highly infectious, or something that multiplies in a very high rate, we would have seen it much more at a much more larger scale. So hopefully it's something that is not as worse as COVID, but it's something that we should always be on the watch out for.
Dr. Abdulaziz Barko, health scientist, joining us from Texas. Thank you so much for joining us on The World Today.
Thank you for having me.
Away from health issues now to the UK, where a British judge has sent the case of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to Interior Minister Priti Patel, who will decide whether he should be extradited to the United States over the release of confidential US documents. The procedural step in what has been a long-running and high-profile legal battle was announced at a hearing in central London following a March decision to deny Australian-born Assange permission to appeal against his extradition. The extradition order must now be signed by Ms. Patel, after which Assange can try to challenge the decision by judicial review. A judge review involves a judge examining the legitimacy of a public body's decision. The 50-year-old Assange is wanted in the US on 18 criminal charges, including breaking a spy law after WikiLeaks published thousands of secret US files back in 2010. But Assange denies any wrongdoing.
Still to come on the program. Maradona's Hand of God shirt gets £4 million bid on first day of auction. We have that and more when we return. Welcome back. And we are tethering back to the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but this time in sports, as organisers of the All England Lawn Tennis Club says tennis players from Russia and Belarus will not be allowed to compete at this year's Wimbledon. Earlier this month, the AELTC said it was in talks with the British government on the participation of players from Russia and Belarus and the grass court Grand Slam. The organisers had earlier planned to announce a decision mid-May before the entry deadline for June 27 to July 10 events. A ban on Russian players prevents world number 2 Daniil Medvedev and Andrei Rublev, who is ranked 8th, from competing in the men's draw. The ban also applies to Anastasia Pavlyuchenkova, who is ranked 15th in the women's rankings.
And Wimbledon is not the only it's just the latest sports federation banning Russian and Belarusian athletes from competing in events. This year there have been others. The Badminton Federation in March cancelled events in Russia and in Belarus, and they banned athletes from those countries from events that month. The International Skating Union and the International Volleyball Federation also made similar moves. The International Tennis Federation cancelled all events in Russia and Belarus, but the tennis bodies ATP and WTA said Russian and Belarusian players can play in their tours but not use their national flags. Also in the month of March, the International Olympic Committee recommended banning Russian and Belarusian athletes. Women's governing body FINA called for an event in Russia to be cancelled and said that Russian and Belarusian athletes would have to compete as neutral athletes. Even soccer's governing federation, FIFA, suspended Russia from this year's Men's World Cup in Qatar and the Women's Euro 2022 tournament, just to name a few. The Channel's television sports editor, Austin Okonapan, joins us now. He is in London. Austin, great to see you as always. And I thought there was supposed to be, this distinction between, political interference in sports. There was not supposed to be political interference in sports. So why are these bodies imposing the bans despite sports being insulated from political dealings between countries? There you are.
Yeah, I'm Archie and Millicent. But yes, we've said it with this Russian invasion of Ukraine. Can you hear me?
We can. Go on.
Okay, so with this Russian invasion of Ukraine, it has brought a number of sanctions from different sporting federations. And I'm not surprised that the All England Lawn Tennis Club, have jumped on it. And according to their statement, Amarachi says that they have a responsibility to limit Russia's global influence through the strongest means possible. And they've checked it. If you take a look at what Daniil Medvedev is doing at the moment with tennis, is ranked second in the world, and with the ranking points up for grabs at Wimbledon, if he goes there and probably win, he might just become the world number one. If Novak Djokovic don't play well. So that's what the All England Lawn Tennis Club are trying to do. Just cut off anything Russian influence globally. That's why this ban is not just on Daniil Medvedev or Sabalenka. It is on all Russian and Belarusian players. Look, Vitolina the other day came out and said we need to get harsher with Russia so that they can understand that the world does not, accept what they're doing. Analysts have been praising the All England Lawn Tennis Club for taking this decision because remember, the French Open has said Russian athletes and Belarusian players can actually come on to compete, but now they're under so much pressure with this latest decision coming from the AELTC, Amara.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, how these players feel about this. The latest, of course, we're talking about is the AELTC, and I wonder how that also impacts on their rankings.
Of course it does, Amarachi, because, this is a Grand Slam event, and I think about 2,000 ranking points up for grabs. And as I said earlier, with what Daniil Medvedev is doing with his tennis at the moment, that can do a lot of good for him if he comes to the competition and probably makes it to the semis or even go on to the finals. Same thing with Sabalenka. She's from Belarus. She's ranked number 5 in the women's ATP rankings. She's such a decent player. There's also Anastasia Pavlyuchenkova. She's Russian, also has got quality. I agree that is so fluid and unpredictable. You do so well, you can just, go on to, get good ranking points. So with them missing out, that means they will not be able to accrue any ranking points. That's more like some stagnancy, not being able to, compete. Russia has come out to say, look, this is so wrong. We don't take it. It's not just tennis. You remember badminton?
Austin? Oh boy, we did glean, a few things from what he said.
Right.
I know some of these players would be very concerned, about,
what will happen.
What happens before. Austin, are you back with us?
Yes, I'm here with you, Mara.
All right. Well, Austin, quickly, I mean, it does seem rather unfair, especially to the fans of these athletes, that, this is happening. But what can the players affect to do in the meantime? Oh, perhaps you hear that at 6 and definitely much later tonight.
Yeah, at 9 o'clock. Well, Austin, if you can hear us, thank you again for showing up. I guess a lot of people are watching this show from London and are putting that much pressure on the bandwidth. So we're coasting home now, and the shirt worn by soccer legend Diego Maradona, who has a religion named after him, by the way, known as the Hand of God, will be fetching some huge cash when auctioned next month. There's an original bid already of £4 million. So this has been received by the online auction, which begins today, so you can still bid. It runs until May 4th.
Indeed, Maradona wore a number 10 jersey in the quarterfinal in Mexico, putting Argentina ahead of punching the ball into the net early in the second half, a goal that came to be known as the Hand of God.
Well, the auction house is Sotheby's. It's rejected claims by the Argentinian's family that that shirt we're looking at, was not one worn by Maradona when he scored the famous goals against England in 1986 and in the World Cup.
Tremendously exciting, and even this morning when we opened up the doors, people were crowding around to look at the shirt. Most exciting, this morning we actually got a bid for £4 million. So that, if you add the buyer's premium and convert it into dollars, that will alone actually be a record for any game-worn item. So the estimated selling value is £4 to £6 million. I think that right in the middle at £5 million is sort of where we would expect bidding. So the auction came about as Steve Hodge, who flicked the ball to Maradona on the Hand of God play, had this in his possession ever since the game. He had loaned it to the National Football Museum, and after having it for a considerable amount of time, he decided that the timing was finally right for him, and he contacted us to do the auction. When proving that this is the genuine shirt from the second half, the important thing was a variety of factors. First, we looked at the provenance. So obviously it came from Steve Hodge, who flicked the ball to Maradona on the Hand of God play. It was then stored in a museum. But most importantly, we undertook a process called photo matching, which is when you look at the shirt in really microscopic detail, even examining individual threads and groups of fabric, and comparing it against photos of the game to the shirt that we have in our possession. And we were able to find conclusive photo matching through a firm outside of the company that we hired to do it.
And finally on the world today, it's a quick stop in Africa, over in Kenya actually, where over 400 girls from the Maasai community have gone through an alternative rite of passage into adulthood.
Should be interesting. The ceremony is part of initiatives to stamp out FGM in communities where the practice is still entrenched despite a government ban.
In traditional Maasai culture, girls were expected to undergo circumcision. A 4-day training program was organized by the African Medical and Research Foundation, AMREF, in Kajiado County, the home of the Maasai community, as an alternative to female genital mutilation and early marriage.
I've learned a lot, and I'm able to differentiate between the bad part of our culture and the good part of our culture, which is very good. And I've learned that to protect my kids, my daughters, my cousins, yeah.
At their graduation ceremony, Maasai elders blessed the girls by applying oil on their foreheads and recited traditional rites.
When we were praying for this girl, there were very old men there. I don't know if you saw them. They were there, our fathers, their grandfathers. So, in fact, they have decided to come and bless the girls to remain uncut. So, if those grannies can embrace that culture, in fact, this thing now has become, there's a walkover in our community.
Kenya outlawed FGM a decade ago with a punishment of 3 years imprisonment and a $2,000 fine. But the practice persists as some communities see it as necessary for social acceptance and increasing their daughters' marriage prospects. According to the United Nations, 1 in 5 Kenyan women and girls aged between 15 and 49 have undergone FGM, which usually involves the partial or total removal of the female genitalia and can cause a host of serious health problems.
FGM is deeply rooted in our culture, in our Maasai culture. And you cannot uproot a tree not unless you remove all the roots. And yet, we know that change of behavior, change of perception and attitude takes time. So that's why we take that time so that people change attitude, change perception, and then accept now to graduate the girls.
In some cases, girls bleed to death or die from infections, and the practice can also cause lifelong painful conditions such as fistula and fatal childbirth complications. According to the United Nations, FGM threatens 4 million girls annually and is practiced in more than 30 countries, largely in Africa, but also in parts of Asia and the Middle East and by diaspora communities in the West.
Some positive news from Kenya.
Indeed, indeed. And FGM is such a great concern, especially to many communities in Africa.
That's it on The World Today. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Mwoka.
And I'm Amarachi Ubani. Have a pleasant evening.